I'm going to spend the last 5 class periods, starting Wednesday, talking about European history, chapters 12 and 13, medieval Europe. So to start off with, we start talking about the Germanic people who began to move in. Now these Huns were not Germanic. They were from Central Asia, and they were, for a while, they threatened both the Germans and the Romans. Now these three, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, they all found their way to Great Britain, the island of Britain. And that's where we get the word England from the word Angle land, the land of the Angles. They took over from the Britons who had lived there before. In Roman times, the Britons had lived there. They took over the Britons, but they didn't take over all at once. Now, legend says that one of the kings who fought off the Angles and Saxons and Jutes for a whole generation was King Arthur. You might have read stories about King Arthur and the Knights of Round Table that included Sir Lancelot. King Arthur would have lived about this time if he existed at all. But the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes eventually overran Britain and drove the Britons out. Some of them went to a place in France called Brittany. Others of them went to Wales, and their descendants are still there living in the western part of Britain called Wales. Vandals. We get the word vandalism because the Vandals came in and sacked Rome, and therefore they lent their name to a bad deed. In 410, the Vandals sacked Rome, and that was a really, really bad moment for the people, for the Romans, who wanted as the world turned upside down, as the world coming to an end. You have your Goths, 2 branches of Goths, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy and brought their culture with them, and eventually practically took over the Italian population. The Romans became mixed with the Ostrogoths and largely died out. The Visigoths went to Spain, and their descendants are still there. Now, as for Latin, the language of the Romans, it was replaced by the language we today call Italian. The Italian language has many Latin words, but Latin became a dead language. The church, and with all due respect to the church tried hard to revive the Latin language to keep it from dying. But in spite of that, it died. It lived on, though, in that a lot of your religious ceremonies were performed in Latin. Bibles were written in Latin for hundreds of years. And even as recently as when I was a kid, doctors would write out prescriptions to pharmacies in Latin, or doctors would write to other doctors in Latin, things that were so personal that they did not want the ordinary public to read, that only the educated could read. And I had teachers when I was in elementary school saying we should all take Latin. And my high school offered Latin, but by the time I got to high school, nobody would take it. And eventually they quit offering it. But Latin, there were attempts made to revive it, but again, it simply would not revive. Latin was replaced by Italian. Now, Western Europe came to be dominated by 2 language families, the Germanic family and the Latin family. The Latin family involves Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and the Germanic family includes German, and you may not realize it, but English. English is considered a Germanic language, even though a high percentage of English words that we use have their origins in the Latin language. Now, if you look at a document printed in English that was written around the year 1000, 1100, or 1200, without special training, you cannot read it. And then if we have figured out how those people pronounced their words, if you hear someone speaking English as was spoken in the 10, 11, and 12, 1300s, without training, you cannot understand it. The English language has changed so much that we simply cannot comprehend the language that they spoke back at the 700, 800 years ago. In contrast, the Arabs, who have kept their language the same for 1400 years. The Romans and Ostrogoths fused and formed a new race, or a new ethnic group called Italians. Now, the Visigoth kingdom never united. They took over Spain, never united. They formed several small kingdoms. And in about the year 700, they were partially conquered by the Muslims. The Muslims never did take over all of Spain, but they took over most of southern Spain. And the Spanish spent some 700 years, 800 years, actually 800 years driving them out. And they finally drove all the Muslims out in the year 1492. And at that point, Queen Isabella felt strong enough or secure enough to give Columbus 3 of her oldest ships. And he set sail westward. A story that I hope all of you are familiar with. But she would not give him the ships until the Muslims, whom they called Moors, were driven out. But anyway, Spain was overrun, partially overrun by the Muslims at first. All right, now another group of these people were the Franks. From this word Frank, we get the word France. We also get the word free. Anyway, well, the word free because these people consider themselves the free people. The Franks, the free people. The Franks moved in and they conquered or took over a lot of what had been formerly called Gaul, but they changed its name from Gaul to France, and their descendants are still living there to this day. Their outstanding king was a king named Clovis. Clovis was of a dynasty called the Merovingian dynasty. Now, folk, this Merovingian dynasty, I'm going to elaborate on a little bit because it has made news in my lifetime. A man named Dan Brown wrote a book called Holy Cross, Holy Grail. Now, are any of you at all familiar with it? In which he said that the Merovingian dynasty, that the word Merovingian means descended from Mary Magdalene, and that the Merovingian dynasty claimed that they were descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and that they were destined to rule the world. And their kings believed that they were actually descended from King David and Solomon. And some experts say that they might have been descended not from Jesus, but from Jesus' brother James, or Jesus' half-brother James, depending on what you believe. But anyway, the Merovingian dynasty, it is said that they are destined to make a comeback someday and rule the world. For a while we lost them to history. Then somebody found a vault that contained the names of the Merovingians, or the names of a line that made it possible to trace the Merovingians. The King of Spain claims he's descended from Merovingians, and the kings of France claimed that they were, even though not on a direct line. But the Merovingian dynasty became powerful, ruled over France. Now Clovis is also remembered for being the first Western king to convert to Catholic Christianity. Very important, because this is how part of the story of how Rome was able to take over and religiously rule much of Western Europe. You might say, well, wasn't Constantine a convert? Constantine converted to another form of Christianity called Arian Christianity. But Clovis was the first king to convert to Roman Catholic Christianity. And it's not hard to understand why he converted. I mean, by the time he became king, his wife was already a Christian. His prime minister was a Christian. More than half his court were Christian already. And the Christianity was taking over that part of the world. So finally he converted and was baptized. And then unfortunately, he forcibly converted the people he conquered into Christianity also. Again, Christians were not completely innocent. Now, here was the problem with the Merovingian dynasty, why they disappeared from history, or supposedly disappeared from history. They felt like that their blood, today we might call it genes, but their blood was superior to the blood of everyone else. Therefore, they could not mix their blood with anyone else, so they only married persons known to have Merovingian blood in them. Basically, what this amounts to is they married their cousins. Well, after a while, the Merovingian kings became mentally and physically weak, and typically a Merovingian king would be born to a child, or to a father who was still a child, maybe 14 years old. His father would die at 20, so he'd be crowned at 6. So it's, again, a typical Merovingian king, crowned at 6 years old. He'd get married at about 14 because they were so afraid that if they didn't marry young, they'd die. And everybody knew they were weak and sickly. So he'd get married about 14, have a child when he was about 15 or 16. Then he died about 21 or 22 and passed the throne on to another child, a son who was a child. Well, needless to say, the Merovingians eventually lost all their respect. And after a while, another dynasty took over called the Carolingians, we'll talk about later. And the last Merovingian was placed in a monastery where supposedly they became extinct. But then someone found a paper that was able to trace a line of them. And again, folk, I mean, you can say, well, if you read conspiracy books, some conspirators say that World War I was caused by persons who wanted to restore the Merovingians. The Habsburgs claimed they were descended from the Merovingians. The Knights Templar claimed they were started by descendants of the Merovingians, if you're familiar with the Templars, which I will talk about later in connection with the Crusades. But anyway, the Merovingians have made news in modern times by persons who claim that a lot of what goes on behind the scenes are attempts to reunite Europe under a descendant of the Merovingians. All right. I'll say this and then close. The Germans had some customs that we don't use much today. But at first, justice was a matter for the families of the offended to take over. Like, if you hurt someone, that you could expect that family to get together and come after you. Now, what this led to were long quarrels between families, and if you've ever read Romeo and Juliet in high school, you know they had a long quarrel between the Montagues and Capulets, and after a few generations, nobody even knew what started the quarrel. And as I read my personal history, back in Scotland, there was a long quarrel between the Cunninghams and Montgomerys. Nobody knew what started it. In our own history, America, there was a long quarrel that lasted a generation between the Hatfields and McCoys. Today, the Hatfields and McCoys meet every year and supposedly make up and throw a big party. But for generations, they fought each other to the death. I mean, they killed each other one after another. But it was felt like that if you wronged somebody, your family would come after you. I mean, the offended person's family would come after you. The Romans told them, no, justice is a matter for the state. If somebody hurts somebody else, the state is supposed to come after them. It took a long time for the Germans to learn this lesson. But some other things they had about justice was the Wehrgeld. The Wehrgeld was a fine. In other words, instead of a family coming after you if you offended somebody, instead of the family, they would simply tell the state, and the state would decide, well, yeah, you've been offended. So the state would issue a fine called a Wehrgeld against the person who committed the offense. And the fine money then would go to the offended person. Similar to what we do today when we sue at law. Compurgation. To try to decide an issue, they get together a bunch of witnesses, and these witnesses would swear an oath that they saw an event or saw something happen. Now, obviously, there are a lot of crimes that are committed where nobody sees anything, but persons who would swear oaths of guilt or innocence, I mean, I saw this person or I saw that this person didn't do the crime. Now, the other one, ordeal. O-R-D. Now, trial by ordeal was where the accused would either lie on a bed of spikes or walk on some hot coals. The purpose of that being that if you were innocent, you would heal more quickly than you would if you were guilty. Now, folk, a lot of medical doctors will tell you there is probably some validity to this. I mean, if you get wounded by a hot iron and you're innocent, you might heal more quickly than a person who was wounded by a hot iron who was guilty. It is known that guilt is probably instrumental in causing a whole lot of sickness, a whole lot of cancers, a whole lot of illnesses, and persons who are sick all the time, not always, but might be carrying a weight of a whole lot of guilt. Something similar we do today is a lie detector test. Now, lie detector tests are known to be able to be fooled, so we don't use them. They're not considered evidence in court, but we still have them. It's called a polygraph. And the idea is that if a person is asked a question about something he doesn't want known, his blood pressure will rise. So if you ever take a polygraph, the administrator of the test will ask you what your name is, what your social security number is, where you were born. All these you can answer, you know, truthfully. And then when he asks you about something that you don't want to tell, your blood pressure will change. Now, normally. Now, folk, I'll say this. There are some people in the world who have lied so much for so long that they can do it without their blood pressure changing. Now, that's not true of most people. It's also known if you do without sleep for 40 or 50 hours and take the test, you can sometimes fool the tester because your body is just too tired and too weak for your blood pressure to rise when somebody asks you something you don't. But again, it doesn't always work. All right, I recall an incident where I was at Lockheed where that me and an older lady agreed that we were going to tell the rest of the crew that she'd been promoted to a certain position, and I said, okay, I'll start the rumor. Problem was I couldn't start the rumor without just cracking up because it was false. I knew it. If I had a blood pressure thing attached to me, my blood pressure would have changed. Some people, though, get to where they can tell a bold-faced lie constantly. I mean, they're just habitual liars. And they can lie without even blushing, without smiling, without their blood pressure changing, without cracking up. Nevertheless, again, these are not the best ways of determining guilt or innocence, perhaps, but they were the best they had, and apparently worked.